The morning mist clung to the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as Lance Sergeant Richard Williams adjusted his scarlet tunic for what would be the most important day of his military career. At 28 years old, he had served in the British Army for over a decade, completing 2 tours in Afghanistan and earning commendations for his unwavering discipline and leadership. Standing guard at the Queen's residence was considered the pinnacle of ceremonial duty and honor reserved for only the most exemplary soldiers. Richard came from a long line of military men. His grandfather had fought in World War II, his father served in the Falklands, and his younger brother was currently deployed with the Royal Marines. The Williams family understood duty, honor, and the weight of tradition. When Richard first donned the iconic bearskin hat and red uniform of the Queen's Guard, his father had tears in his eyes. It represented everything their family stood for: service, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to crown and country. The rules governing the Queen's Guard were sacred and absolute. During their 2-hour shifts, guards were forbidden from speaking, moving unnecessarily, or acknowledging the public in any way. They were living symbols of British military excellence, their stillness representing the unshakable strength of the monarchy itself. Breaking protocol wasn't just a breach of orders, it was a betrayal of centuries of tradition, and could result in immediate dismissal from service, court-martial, and permanent disgrace. Richard had never questioned these rules. They were as fundamental to him as breathing. He had stood motionless through thunderstorms, ignored tourist provocations, and maintained his stoic composure even when children tried to make him laugh or when adults attempted to distract him with silly jokes and faces. He was, by all accounts, the perfect Queen's Guard, a man who understood that personal feelings had no place when duty called. Meanwhile, in a modest flat in East London, 6-year-old Emma Thompson was fighting a battle that no child should ever have to face. 3 months earlier, what her mother Sarah had initially dismissed as persistent tiredness and occasional bruising had been revealed as acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The diagnosis had shattered their world with the devastating precision of a lightning strike. Emma had always been a spirited child with an infectious laugh and an imagination that knew no bounds. She loved fairy tales, especially those featuring brave princesses and noble knights. Her bedroom walls were covered with pictures of castles, and she would spend hours creating elaborate stories about royal adventures. When she learned about the Queen's Guards during a school project, she became absolutely fascinated by these real-life knights who protected the Queen. The chemotherapy treatments had been brutal. Emma's golden curls had fallen out in clumps, her rosy cheeks had become pale and hollow, and the vibrant energy that once seemed limitless now came in precious, fleeting moments. But through it all, she maintained an extraordinary spirit that amazed everyone who met her. The nurses at Great Ormond Street Hospital called her their little princess, and she would regale them with stories about the royal palace and the brave soldiers who guarded it. Sarah Thompson, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, had watched her daughter's health decline with a helplessness that threatened to consume her. The medical bills were mounting, her work hours had been drastically reduced to accommodate Emma's treatment schedule, and the constant fear of losing her only child was a weight that pressed down on her chest with every breath. But Emma's unwavering optimism and determination kept Sarah going through the darkest moments. During one particularly difficult round of treatment, when Emma was too weak to leave her hospital bed, she made a request that broke her mother's heart. She wanted to visit Buckingham Palace and see the Queen's Guards in person. She had seen them in pictures and videos, but she dreamed of standing before these real-life protectors and maybe, just maybe, getting one of them to acknowledge her presence. It seemed like such a simple wish, but given Emma's deteriorating condition and the strict protocols surrounding the palace, Sarah knew it would be nearly impossible to fulfill. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic about Emma's treatment response, but recent tests had revealed complications. The leukemia was proving more aggressive than initially anticipated, and the treatment options were becoming limited. Time was becoming a luxury they could no longer afford, and every day was now precious beyond measure. Dr. Patricia Chin, Emma's primary oncologist, had witnessed many families navigate the crushing reality of childhood cancer, but Emma's case was particularly heart-wrenching. The little girl's spirit remained unbroken despite the mounting challenges, and her constant chatter about wanting to meet a real Queen's Guard had become a recurring theme during their medical consultations. Dr. Chen understood the therapeutic value of hope and had been exploring ways to potentially make Emma's wish come true, though she knew the logistics would be incredibly complex. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Richard Williams continued his duties with mechanical precision, unaware that his life was about to intersect with that of a brave little girl whose courage would soon test everything he believed about duty, protocol, and the true meaning of service. The morning shift changes continued with their usual ceremony. Tourists gathered behind the gates with their cameras ready, and life proceeded with its normal rhythm. Richard's commanding officer, Major Charles Pemberton, was a stern man who had served for over 20 years and took immense pride in maintaining the traditions and standards of the Queen's Guard. He regularly reminded his men that they were not just soldiers but living representations of British military heritage. Any deviation from protocol was not just discouraged, it was absolutely forbidden. The Major had built his career on discipline and order, and he expected nothing less from the men under his command. The weather that October morning was particularly crisp, with autumn leaves scattered across the palace grounds and a hint of winter in the air. Richard stood at his post, rifle at his side, eyes fixed straight ahead, embodying the very essence of military bearing. He had no way of knowing that somewhere across London, a little girl named Emma was discussing her dream of meeting him with her mother, or that circumstances were already in motion that would soon force him to choose between following orders and following his heart. The tourists continued their daily pilgrimage to the palace gates, some hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty, others simply marveling at the pageantry and tradition on display. Children pressed their faces against the iron bars, parents snapped photos, and guides shared stories about the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. It was a scene that had played out thousands of times before, but today would be different. Today, the unbreakable would bend, the immovable would move, and a soldier's act of compassion would remind the world that humanity's greatest strength lies not in following rules, but in knowing when those rules must be set aside for something far more important. The stage was set for an encounter that would challenge everything Richard Williams thought he knew about duty, honor, and service. An encounter that would test the very foundations of military protocol against the simple wish of a dying child. An encounter that would prove that sometimes the most courageous thing a soldier can do is to remember that beneath the uniform, the ceremony, and the centuries of tradition, beats the heart of a human being capable of extraordinary compassion. The fluorescent lights of the pediatric oncology ward hummed softly as Emma Thompson sat cross-legged on her hospital bed, a colorful headscarf covering her bald head while she carefully colored a picture of Buckingham Palace. Her thin fingers gripped the red crayon with determination as she filled in the uniform of a Queen's Guard, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. This had become her daily ritual during treatment, creating artwork of the palace and its protectors while dreaming of the day she might see them in person. Sarah Thompson watched her daughter from the bedside chair where she had spent countless hours over the past months. The dark circles under Sarah's eyes told the story of sleepless nights filled with worry, medical consultations, and the constant vigilance that comes with caring for a critically ill child. At 32, she had aged years in just a few months, but her love for Emma remained the unwavering constant that kept her going through each devastating setback. Emma looked up from her coloring with bright eyes that still held traces of the spirited child she had been before cancer invaded their lives. "Mummy, do you think the Queen's Guards ever get tired of standing so still?" she asked, her voice carrying that mixture of innocence and wisdom that children facing serious illness often develop. Sarah smiled, brushing a gentle hand across Emma's cheek. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I imagine they're very dedicated to their job of protecting the Queen. I think they must be the bravest people in the whole world," Emma declared with absolute certainty. "They're like real-life knights from my fairy tales, except they're real and they live right here in London." She held up her drawing proudly. "I drew this one with a smile, even though I know they're not supposed to smile while they're working. But I think he would smile if he met me, don't you think?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, and Sarah felt her heart break a little more. Emma's latest test results had not been encouraging. The aggressive treatment protocol wasn't working as well as the medical team had hoped, and Dr. Chin had gently suggested that they begin discussing palliative care options and ways to make Emma as comfortable as possible for whatever time remained. The concept of whatever time remained was something Sarah refused to fully accept, even as the reality pressed against her consciousness like a physical weight. She had researched experimental treatments, reached out to specialists around the world, and explored every possible avenue for hope. But the medical facts were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, and Dr. Chen's conversations were gradually shifting from cure to comfort, from aggressive treatment to quality of life. It was during one of these difficult discussions that Dr. Chin had mentioned the potential benefits of fulfilling Emma's wish to visit Buckingham Palace. Studies had shown that positive experiences and the fulfillment of dreams could have measurable impacts on both physical and emotional well-being in pediatric patients. While it wouldn't cure Emma's leukemia, it might provide her with joy and hope during an incredibly challenging time. The logistics, however, seemed insurmountable. Emma's immune system was severely compromised from the chemotherapy, making exposure to crowds potentially dangerous. The palace had strict security protocols that didn't typically accommodate special requests from private citizens. And even if they could arrange a visit, there was no guarantee that Emma would be well enough on any given day to make the journey across London. But Emma's wish had taken on a life of its own within the hospital community. Nurses began sharing the story during their breaks, doctors mentioned it to colleagues, and word eventually reached Patricia Hughes, a social worker who specialized in connecting critically ill children with wish fulfillment organizations. Patricia had extensive experience navigating complex bureaucratic challenges to make seemingly impossible dreams come true. Patricia first met Emma on a Tuesday morning when the little girl was feeling particularly weak from a recent treatment session. Despite her fatigue, Emma's eyes lit up when Patricia introduced herself and explained that she might be able to help make the palace visit happen. Emma launched into an elaborate explanation of her fascination with the Queen's Guards, complete with detailed descriptions of their uniforms, their duties, and her theories about what they might be thinking while standing so perfectly still. "I think they must have the most important job in the whole world," Emma explained seriously. "They protect the Queen, and the Queen takes care of everyone in England, so really they're protecting all of us. That makes them like superheroes, doesn't it?" Patricia was struck by Emma's mature understanding of duty and service, concepts that seemed far beyond her 6 years but had clearly captured her imagination in profound ways. As she listened to Emma's passionate descriptions of royal protocol and military tradition, Patricia realized this wasn't just a simple wish to see famous landmarks, it was a deep connection to ideals of courage, dedication, and service that resonated with Emma's own battle against her illness. The first step in making the visit happen involved extensive coordination with Emma's medical team. Dr. Chin would need to carefully monitor Emma's white blood cell counts and overall condition to identify a safe window for travel. The trip would require specialized medical equipment, a nurse to accompany them, and detailed contingency plans for any emergencies that might arise during the visit. Sarah found herself caught between hope and fear as the plans began to take shape. The possibility of fulfilling Emma's dream filled her with excitement, but the underlying reason for the urgency, the implicit acknowledgement that opportunities might be limited, was almost too painful to contemplate. She threw herself into the planning process with determined energy, viewing each detail as a way to focus on something positive and concrete. Meanwhile, Patricia began the complex process of reaching out to palace officials and security personnel to explore the possibility of arranging a special visit. Her initial inquiries were met with polite but firm responses about security protocols and the impossibility of making exceptions to established procedures. The palace received thousands of requests each year, and while they sympathized with Emma's situation, they simply couldn't accommodate individual wishes without compromising security and fairness to other applicants. Undeterred, Patricia expanded her approach to include contacts within the military community and veteran organizations. She reached out to retired officers who might have connections within the ceremonial guard units, explored charitable organizations that worked with military families, and investigated any possible channels that might provide access to the palace grounds or advance notice of guard-changing ceremonies. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sergeant Major Robert Crawford, a retired military officer who volunteered with a children's charity, had heard about Emma's story through the veteran network. Robert had served alongside current members of the Queen's Guard and maintained relationships within the ceremonial units. While he couldn't guarantee anything, he agreed to make some discreet inquiries about possible accommodations. Robert's first conversation was with Warrant Officer James Morrison, who supervised scheduling and personnel management for the Queen's Guard. James listened carefully as Robert explained Emma's situation and her fascination with the Guard's dedication and courage. While James couldn't authorize any deviation from protocol, he was moved by the story and agreed to pass the information up the chain of command for consideration. The request eventually reached Major Charles Pemberton, who found himself in the unusual position of weighing military protocol against compassion for a dying child. Pemberton was known for his unwavering adherence to regulations and his strict interpretation of military procedure. His entire career had been built on the principle that rules existed for important reasons and that making exceptions, however well-intentioned, could set dangerous precedents. Yet something about Emma's story resonated with the Major in ways he hadn't expected. His own daughter was roughly the same age, and the thought of her facing such a devastating illness while maintaining such courage and optimism challenged his usually rigid perspective. After several days of consideration and consultation with his superiors, Pemberton made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not authorize any special access to the palace grounds or any deviation from standard guard protocol during official duties. However, he would personally ensure that Emma's visit coincided with the changing of the guard ceremony, that she had the best possible viewing position from the public area, and that his men were made aware of her presence so they could be mentally prepared for the emotional weight of the moment. It wasn't the direct interaction Emma had dreamed of, but it was a significant step forward in acknowledgement from the military hierarchy that her courage and spirit deserved recognition within the bounds of what was possible. The stage was being set for an encounter that would test not just military protocol, but the fundamental question of what it means to serve others with honor and compassion. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, with golden autumn sunlight filtering through the London sky in a way that seemed almost orchestrated for Emma's special day. Sarah had barely slept, alternating between excitement about fulfilling her daughter's dream and anxiety about Emma's health status. The night before, Emma had experienced some nausea and fatigue, common side effects from her recent chemotherapy session, but she had woken up with more energy than she'd shown in weeks. Dr. Chen had given final medical clearance for the trip after reviewing Emma's latest blood work. While her white cell count remained dangerously low, requiring careful precautions and limited exposure time, the doctor felt that the potential emotional benefits outweighed the medical risks for this carefully planned excursion. A pediatric nurse named Janet Morrison would accompany them, along with a portable medical kit containing everything needed to handle potential emergencies. Emma had insisted on wearing her favorite red dress for the occasion, explaining to her mother that she wanted to match the soldiers' uniforms. Sarah had carefully arranged a colorful headscarf around Emma's head, and despite the weight loss and pale complexion that marked her battle with cancer, Emma's excitement gave her a radiant glow that reminded Sarah of the vibrant child she had been before their world changed forever. The journey to Buckingham Palace felt both eternal and fleeting. Emma pressed her face against the taxi window, pointing out landmarks and sharing facts she had learned about London's history from the educational videos she watched during treatment sessions. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and even Janet, who had accompanied many children on similar journeys, found herself genuinely moved by Emma's joy and anticipation. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, Lance Sergeant Richard Williams was preparing for what he expected would be another routine shift. Major Pemberton had briefly mentioned that there would be a special visitor in the crowd today, a young girl who was particularly interested in the Queen's Guard, but such notifications weren't uncommon. The guards often received advance notice about VIP visitors, school groups, or individuals with special circumstances who might be attending the ceremony. Richard methodically completed his pre-duty inspection, ensuring every element of his uniform met the exacting standards required. His scarlet tunic was perfectly pressed, his brass buttons gleamed with fresh polish, and his bearskin cap sat at precisely the correct angle. He checked his rifle, adjusted his white gloves, and mentally reviewed the protocols that governed every aspect of his behavior during the next 2 hours. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock, and by 10:30, crowds had already begun gathering behind the palace gates. The autumn tourist season brought visitors from around the world, all eager to witness this display of British military tradition and pageantry. Among them, in a specially arranged position near the front of the barriers, stood Sarah, Emma, and Janet, with Emma's wheelchair positioned to give her the clearest possible view of the proceedings. Emma's eyes were wide with wonder as she took in the grandeur of Buckingham Palace for the first time. The imposing facade, the ornate gates, the perfectly manicured grounds, everything was even more magnificent than she had imagined from pictures and videos. But her attention was completely captured when the first guards appeared, marching with synchronized precision that seemed almost choreographic in its perfection. "Mummy, they're even more amazing than I thought they would be," Emma whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Look how straight they stand and how perfectly they march. They really are like knights from my fairy tales." Richard took his position at the main gate, standing at attention with the disciplined stillness that had been drilled into him through years of training. From his peripheral vision, he could see the crowd gathering, but his focus remained straight ahead, his mind centered on maintaining the absolute composure required of his role. He was a living symbol of military excellence, a guardian of centuries-old tradition, and nothing was more important than upholding that sacred trust. The ceremony proceeded with its usual precision and grandeur. The old guard marched out with perfect synchronization, their movements sharp and deliberate, their bearing embodying the pride and professionalism of the British military. The regimental band played traditional marches, their music echoing off the palace walls and adding to the magical atmosphere that surrounded the ancient ritual. Emma watched every moment with rapt attention, occasionally pointing out details to her mother or asking quiet questions about what was happening. Her knowledge of military protocol impressed the adults around her, and her genuine appreciation for the ceremony was evident in every gesture and expression. This wasn't just entertainment for her, it was witnessing something truly sacred and important. As the new guard began marching into position, Richard caught sight of a small figure in a red dress sitting in a wheelchair near the front of the crowd. Even from a distance, something about the child drew his attention. Perhaps it was the way she sat perfectly still, mirroring his own motionless stance, or the intensity with which she watched every movement of the guards. Whatever it was, Richard found his awareness shifting slightly, though his physical position remained unchanged. The moment that would change everything came unexpectedly. As Richard took his final position for the day's duty shift, a gentle breeze caught Emma's colorful headscarf, lifting it from her head and revealing her baldness to the crowd around her. Several tourists turned to look, some with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable recognition of serious illness. Emma quickly reached up to retrieve her scarf, but the moment of vulnerability was evident. Instead of embarrassment or distress, Emma's response surprised everyone around her. She carefully repositioned her headscarf and then, with a courage that defied her 6 years and frail condition, she raised her small hand in a formal military salute toward Richard's position. Her tiny hand trembled slightly from weakness, but her gesture was unmistakably respectful and sincere, one soldier acknowledging another. Richard saw the salute, and, in that instant, everything changed. This wasn't just another tourist seeking attention or trying to break his concentration. This was a child, clearly fighting her own battle, offering him the highest form of respect she knew how to give. The military salute, performed with obvious effort despite her physical limitations, communicated more than words ever could about courage, respect, and shared understanding of duty. The protocols that had governed Richard's entire career suddenly felt less important than responding to this extraordinary display of bravery. Here was a little girl who clearly understood something fundamental about service and sacrifice, who had come to witness not just pageantry but genuine dedication to something greater than oneself. Her salute wasn't asking him to break protocol, it was honoring what he represented. For several seconds that felt like hours, Richard faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Everything he had been trained to believe told him to maintain his position, ignore the interaction, and continue his duty unchanged. But everything he believed about honor, courage, and service told him that this moment called for something more than rigid adherence to rules. The choice he made next would echo far beyond that single morning, challenging assumptions about military discipline, human compassion, and the true meaning of service. In a moment that would define both their lives, Lance Sergeant Richard Williams made a decision that proved sometimes the greatest act of military bearing is knowing when to respond to a fellow warrior's salute, regardless of the age, size, or condition of the soldier offering it. The crowd around Emma had begun to notice the interaction, creating a circle of anticipation and tension as witnesses sensed they were about to observe something extraordinary. Sarah gripped Emma's hand tighter, understanding that whatever happened next would be remembered by her daughter forever. Janet watched with professional concern, ready to intervene if Emma became overwhelmed by the attention or emotion of the moment. But Emma remained focused entirely on Richard, her small hands still raised in salute, her eyes filled with hope and admiration, waiting to see if her gesture of respect would be acknowledged by the real-life knight she had traveled so far to honor. The palace, the crowds, the centuries of tradition, everything faded except for the connection between a dying child's courage and a soldier's choice between duty and humanity. Time seemed suspended as Richard Williams stood frozen between two worlds, the rigid discipline of military protocol and the unmistakable call of human compassion. Emma's small hand remained raised in salute, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that cut through every barrier of rank, regulation, and royal tradition. In that crystalline moment, Richard saw not just a sick child seeking attention, but a fellow warrior offering the highest form of respect one soldier could give another. The weight of decision pressed down on Richard's shoulders like a physical force. His commanding officer, Major Pemberton, stood just 20 yards away, observing the ceremony with his usual stern attention to detail. Camera phones were already emerging from the crowd as tourists began to sense something extraordinary was happening. The international media presence that always surrounded palace events meant that whatever choice Richard made would likely be recorded and potentially broadcast around the world. But in Emma's trembling salute, Richard recognized something that transcended military hierarchy and public scrutiny. This 6-year-old girl, fighting a battle more challenging than any he had faced in Afghanistan, had traveled across London despite her weakness to honor what she saw as genuine heroism. She wasn't asking him to abandon his post or compromise security, she was simply acknowledging their shared understanding of duty, courage, and service to something greater than themselves. Richard's internal struggle reflected years of conditioning against the pull of immediate human connection. Every fiber of his training screamed that maintaining position was paramount, that personal feelings had no place in ceremonial duty, that centuries of tradition demanded his absolute stillness. Yet Emma's gesture spoke to deeper principles that had drawn him to military service in the first place: the commitment to protect others, the recognition of courage wherever it appears, and the fundamental truth that honor sometimes requires action rather than adherence to rules. The crowd's energy shifted as more people noticed the interaction between the uniformed guard and the small girl in the wheelchair. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for better views, teenagers raised phones to record whatever was about to happen, and the general murmur of tourist chatter gradually quieted into expectant silence. Even other guards, trained to maintain their own absolute focus, found their attention drawn to the unfolding drama. Sarah Thompson felt her heart hammering as she watched her daughter maintain her salute with determination that defied her physical limitations. Emma's arm trembled from the effort, her face pale with exertion, but her expression remained fixed with absolute concentration and hope. This moment represented everything Emma had dreamed about during countless hospital hours: the chance to connect with the real-life heroes who had captured her imagination and inspired her own battle against impossible odds. Major Pemberton noticed the disturbance in the crowd's attention and followed their collective gaze to Emma's position. His military mind immediately assessed the situation, an ill child attempting to interact with one of his guards during an official ceremony. Protocol was clear: guards were not to acknowledge public attempts at interaction, regardless of circumstances. The Major's instinct was to intervene, but something about the dignity of the little girl's salute gave him pause. Richard could feel the weight of observation from multiple directions: his commanding officer, the crowd, his fellow guards, and most importantly, the courageous child whose gesture demanded a response that honored her bravery rather than dismissed it. The seconds stretched on, each one carrying enormous implications for his career, his reputation, and his own understanding of what military service truly meant. The decision, when it came, felt both inevitable and revolutionary. Richard Williams, Lance Sergeant in Her Majesty's Guard, slowly and deliberately returned Emma Thompson's salute with military precision that acknowledged not just her gesture, but her courage, her spirit, and her rightful place among warriors who refused to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps of surprise and appreciation rippled through the gathered tourists, followed by spontaneous applause that grew louder as more people understood what they had witnessed. Camera phones captured the moment from dozens of angles, ensuring that the image of a decorated soldier saluting a 6-year-old cancer patient would soon travel around the world as a symbol of compassion triumphing over rigid protocol. Emma's face transformed with pure joy and validation. Her own salute had been acknowledged by a real Queen's Guard, confirming her worthiness as a fellow soldier in the fight against adversity. She carefully lowered her hand with obvious effort, her smile radiant despite her physical exhaustion. For the first time since her diagnosis, she felt truly seen and respected for her courage rather than pitted for her illness. Sarah burst into tears, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness and recognition her daughter had received. This simple gesture from a stranger had given Emma something no medical treatment could provide: acknowledgement that her battle was real, important, and worthy of honor from someone she considered a true hero. The moment validated Emma's courage and transformed her struggle into something heroic rather than merely tragic. Major Pemberton faced his own moment of decision as he witnessed his subordinate's clear breach of protocol. Military regulations were unambiguous about guards maintaining position and avoiding interaction with the public. Richard's action, however, well-intentioned, constituted a clear violation of orders that could justify immediate disciplinary action, potential demotion, or even dismissal from service. Yet the Major was also a father, a human being who recognized extraordinary courage when he saw it. Emma's determination to honor military service despite her obvious illness, combined with Richard's respectful acknowledgement of her bravery, represented something that transcended ordinary rule-breaking. This wasn't a guard seeking attention or showing off for tourists. This was a soldier recognizing a fellow warrior and responding with appropriate military courtesy. The ceremony continued around them, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. Other guards maintained their positions with perhaps slightly less rigidity, as if Richard's moment of humanity had reminded them all that their service was ultimately about protecting and honoring people rather than simply following abstract protocols. The crowd remained more attentive and respectful, sensing they had witnessed something genuinely meaningful rather than mere pageantry. News of the interaction began spreading immediately through social media channels as witnesses shared photos and videos of the moment. Within hours, the image of Richard saluting Emma would be trending across multiple platforms, accompanied by explanations of her battle with cancer and praise for the guard's compassionate response. The story resonated with audiences worldwide as a reminder that individual acts of kindness can illuminate universal truths about courage, compassion, and human connection. Richard completed the remainder of his shift with the same professional bearing he had always maintained, but internally he was processing the magnitude of what had occurred. He had risked his career for a spontaneous gesture of respect, and regardless of any consequences he might face, he felt certain he had made the right choice. Emma's courage had called forth his own, creating a moment of authentic human connection that honored the deeper purposes of military service. As the changing of the guard ceremony concluded and crowds began to disperse, Emma remained in position, still glowing from the recognition she had received. Her wish to meet a real Queen's Guard had been fulfilled in ways she had never imagined, not through special arrangements or exceptions to rules, but through a genuine moment of mutual respect between two people committed to fighting their respective battles with honor and determination. The afternoon would bring medical appointments and treatment schedules, but for now, Emma had something precious to carry forward, proof that her courage was real, recognized, and worthy of honor from someone whose opinion mattered deeply to her. Richard Williams had given her far more than a return salute. He had confirmed her identity as a warrior deserving of respect from fellow soldiers in the ongoing fight against adversity. The ripple effects of those few seconds would continue expanding in ways neither Richard nor Emma could have anticipated, touching lives around the world and challenging assumptions about duty, compassion, and the true meaning of service to others. They had created a moment that proves sometimes the most important protocols are written not in military manuals, but in the unbreakable bonds between courageous souls who recognize and honor each other across all boundaries of age, rank, and circumstance. The photograph that captured Richard Williams returning Emma Thompson's salute became one of those rare images that transcend their original context to become symbols of something universal and profound. Within 24 hours of being posted online, the image had been shared millions of times across social media platforms, accompanied by the story of a 6-year-old cancer patient whose courage had moved a Queen's Guard to break protocol in acknowledgement of her bravery. Major Charles Pemberton found himself in an unprecedented situation the following morning as his superior officers demanded explanations for why one of his guards had violated centuries-old protocols during an official ceremony. Phone calls came from palace officials, military headquarters, and government ministries, all seeking to understand how such a breach of conduct had occurred and what disciplinary measures would be implemented. But the Major also found his office flooded with messages of a very different nature. Letters, emails, and phone calls poured in from around the world, praising Richard's compassionate response and sharing stories of how the image had touched lives across every continent. Parents of sick children wrote to thank him for showing their kids that picture this: you're standing outside Buckingham Palace on a grey London morning. Tourists snap photos, children press their faces against the iron gates, and the Queen's Guards stand motionless in their iconic red uniforms and towering black hats. These soldiers are trained to be living statues. They don't speak, they don't move, they don't react. Breaking protocol could end their career, tarnish centuries of tradition, and bring shame upon the crown itself. But what happens when a dying child's final wish collides with 500 years of royal protocol? What happens when a man trained to follow orders without question must choose between his duty to the crown and his duty to humanity? What happens when love proves stronger than tradition, when compassion conquers protocol, and when a single moment of kindness echoes across the world? This is the story of Lance Sergeant Richard Williams, a decorated soldier who risked everything for 6-year-old Emma Thompson, a little girl whose battle with leukemia would teach an entire nation about the true meaning of courage. This is the story of how one guard's decision to break an unbreakable rule changed 2 lives forever and reminded us all that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see the person behind the protocol. Get ready for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about duty, sacrifice, and the power of human connection. Because sometimes, the greatest act of service isn't following orders, it's knowing when to break them.